Okay then, people. So remember, not next week, but the week after, you're going to have your online assessments, and they're going to be the two Hamlet questions and a Gatsby question. And what we've done so far, we've done a bit of Hamlet and a bit of Gatsby revision. I'm going to do a bit more Gatsby revision today. Next week, you'll be able to do a little bit more Hamlet revision. And then the week after, you'll have your kind of essay questions. Just remember, though, you should be doing more to kind of prep for these outside of just doing these sessions as well, though, okay? So, in terms of what we're looking at today, I want to introduce you to a kind of more extended piece of criticism. So when we looked at the last Gatsby session, we looked at that piece of kind of wider reading that you might work in there, looked at kind of how it might work into points. And I did bring in a kind of very brief bit of criticism just on a slide, just to show you that working in as well. But with this time, rather than focus on the piece of criticism, the wider reading as our central thing, we're focusing on the piece of criticism. So you'll have that with the email that came with this. I'm going to give you an example question, and I'm going to kind of bookend the discussion with this. So I'm going to introduce the question, get you to think about it at the start of the session, think about your kind of lines of argument that would go with it. Then I'm going to introduce the criticism, see how that could kind of build into the question as well, and then kind of come back to it and give you an example point towards the end. Yeah, that there is, don't panic on this. I just want to take the opportunity to also kind of discuss kind of wider reading options and kind of reiterate the expectations for the final exam in relation to wider reading, just because I think it's a sensible opportunity now whilst people are kind of trapped inside. So when I introduce that bit, just be aware I'm not telling you that before the exam you've got to read another book or anything like that. It's just starting to introduce you to it before I start hammering on about it constantly. So here's my question that I'm going to kind of focus around. American literature often obsesses over an idealized past that appears better than the present or future. Discuss how far you've found this to be the case. So imagine that would be your question. Now, the first thing I want you to do, just kind of pause it for literally a minute, look at the question, pick out the key words within that question that are going to set up the debate that's going to kind of follow as you're looking and kind of answering, okay? Okay, so remember these questions are set up to kind of give you different routes into answering them. So you could look at that word often within it, the idea that this is a common trend that happens a lot, and you could say, well, actually maybe it happens a bit, but it doesn't happen all the time. You can look at the idea of obsesses over an idealized past. And again, you can argue that, maybe it looks at this, but it doesn't obsess over the idea. You can say that it's only a part of the novel and the narrative that comes into it. You can look at that kind of idea of the idealized past, and that kind of idea that maybe that implies something perfect, whereas you can say, well, it appears better, but maybe not perfect. And you can argue that maybe, is it better or not? You can argue and sort of challenge the quotation as a whole. So there are different ways of kind of opening this up. Now, before we go any further, and before I introduce kind of, how I would approach it, and the way that I would approach it are not the only ways of approaching it. They're simply how I would kind of envisage my answer going. I want you to sit and, again, challenge yourself, do a kind of 10-minute plan of how you would answer this question using The Great Gatsby, because you've got to get used to making a use of this planning time in and of itself. And kind of ensuring that you're kind of using that sensibly, okay? Okay, so if I was kind of planning this out as my response, I would do something along these lines. This would be the kind of progression through my argument and looking at it kind of around both sides. I'd start off, I'd talk about the fact that it's a retrospective narrative. It looks backwards. And within this, we've got Nick's returns to the West and this kind of more traditional ideals. Because of that return, it maybe does suggest that the past is viewed as better, and those kind of more traditional ideals are better than the modern, and the kind of the future potentially. You can open that up. It doesn't have to be that it's necessarily idealized. You can take a kind of middle ground in a grey area, but that's be how I kind of started off. And I would then move into the way that throughout the novel, areas of kind of modern society are very often kind of contrasted with more traditional elements, and the more traditional and older elements and past elements often come out more favourably. So I would take examples like Gatsby's house as opposed to Tom's house, and the way the two settings are contrasted, and how Gatsby's house is kind of a failure as opposed to Tom's more traditional colonial mansion. And I could go on. I could look at instances where it shows a disgust at the kind of more modern lifestyle and the morality that goes with it, or kind of areas it focuses in on and makes them seem bad. So we might look at the Valley of Ashes. We might look at the party in Myrtle's home. We might look at the kind of wider immorality that goes with the kind of the affair and things like this. Then I would I'm kind of arguing around. I've tended towards one side, although there's kind of mediation in terms of this argument, and I'm looking at it from different directions. I'd then move on to kind of challenging it more directly. And I'd say that there are areas where glamour is kind of given to modern America. So through Gatsby himself, through the initial romanticism of the parties, I might still have it in a kind of, although this is often undone, as part of it. So in certain ways, this modern America then seems, not as bad. It's not necessarily better, but it's still not unpleasant. And I could then kind of focus in on Gatsby as a figure specifically, and that he is a figure of modern America, and he's the one who's romanticized far more than figures of tradition and past America like Tom and Daisy. So that potentially provides me another kind of point of argument. And then I'd probably kind of try and close down the essay by saying that whilst Gatsby's kind of romanticized, whilst his vision is romanticized, arguably in a sense, he's still somebody pursuing these older ideas, these past ideas. So I would obviously be building evidence in alongside each of those points, but they're essentially the kind of root of my argument and how it kind of progresses through across the course of the essay. Now, I then want to kind of think, how am I going to get in some criticism with this? And I've chosen for you a kind of shorter piece of criticism. Giltrow and Stouck. I don't know how you pronounce their sort of surnames, but that's how I'm going to go with it. Now, the one I've kind of picked for you, we're starting to kind of build up the levels. I think it's quite accessible, but as you go through it, you may well have to look up things that go with it. This is starting to push up to kind of harder levels at certain ways. So the expectation here is, as you read it, you should be able to pick up useful things. If you need to look things up, look them up. You're not necessarily going to kind of understand things instantaneously at the first read through. That's not the expectation. Don't be worried if you don't. Just work at it and, fill in the gaps. All right, sorry, I paused there at a weird moment because the cat was eating the window. Just being a bit odd. Right. So what I want you to do with the article that's sent with this, you need to kind of read through, summarize the overall lines of argument, and essentially those overall lines of argument that they make can be paraphrased into your responses, even without kind of a direct quotation that goes with it. You then want to note any points that you might disagree with, because in the course of your essays you can kind of argue around, you can challenge critical points of view as well. It's useful if you kind of identify key evidence and techniques that the author is focusing on to prove their point. Again, because you can then reflect this and use this in your own arguments. Even if you don't use the critic themselves, you don't have the critic's name, you can still reference the kind of techniques that they've noted. They can form part of your argument. And when you're looking at a piece of longer criticism like this, try to choose kind of 3 good quotations that are going to show a kind of clear view of the author and that they can be kind of worked into your essay directly. I know when I do it, I kind of end up with far more than 3 initially, and I then have to kind of work it down to the ones that I want to choose more directly. When you're looking at these, it's also useful to kind of look at any other critics that they reference, because it potentially gives you further reading material that you might go on to. And oh, it's cut off slightly, but never mind. The other thing to bear in mind is that when you are kind of looking at these pieces of criticism, just bear in mind the kind of writing style that goes with them, because when you're responding to these questions, you're essentially in many ways being asked to write in the same writing style as they're writing in, with a kind of more specific question in mind. So just think as you're reading this, how are they inserting quotations? How are they building in references to other critics? How are they kind of constructing their argument? And again, it's a way for you to improve your writing and push towards those top grades as well. So have a read through. This will take you a bit longer. This will be kind of probably the meatier part of the lesson. Spend time reading it properly, highlighting it if you're printing out or making notes somewhere on the kind of key content of it. And as I say, if there are points you don't understand, look it up. Don't just sit there and look baffled. And if there are follow-up questions or points you still didn't understand afterwards, email me and ask. But you're not expected to kind of understand every word instantaneously, remember. Right, okay, we're going to carry on, although the cat is having a biting session. There we go, it's just randomly biting my arm. Okay, so if we had to kind of summarize the article, essentially it's making the argument that Nick, as the narrative voice, is kind of presented as conflicted on how to view Gatsby. Ultimately, kind of desires a return to those more kind of traditional values. And through that voice of Nick, there's then the implication that Fitzgerald and the novel itself kind of advocates this view as well. Right, never mind. And Nick himself is kind of placed in such a way that he kind of positions himself as this onlooker. He's looking at what's happening, but he's kind of not joining directly. He's kind of positioning himself as part of the more kind of traditional classes and the kind of the older world. Right, we'll use that one instead. And it focuses here around several different kind of techniques that are used in order to do this. It focuses on apposition, which is essentially kind of placing 2 things side by side, where one kind of essentially kind of clarifies the other. And this is talked about in terms of that kind of romanticizing of kind of Gatsby. He's such an idiot, Cat. It talks about the kind of the way in which Fitzgerald puts in the dialogue, or has Nick build up the dialogue, the modes of speech, and the way that that's used to kind of separate him from those kind of cruder aspects of society. And then it talks about the kind of the use of the generalizations, those kind of seeming universal truths, and how they kind of come into it as well. This is really inconvenient. It's quite painful. Okay, I'll pause it for a minute until the cat's done, I think. Okay, so if we then move on to thinking about the kind of bits that we might pick out more directly, I'd take this one. I had two sides of kind of bits that I'd start with, and then I've kind of narrowed it down. And even with these ones, whilst I would try and remember them in an overall sense for an exam, I wouldn't necessarily be quoting these end to end in the exam. I'd be doing some kind of paraphrasing around them, but it's useful to have it all just to help kind of contextualize around it. So I like this one. The critical inclination of The Great Gatsby is not just towards reform, but towards restoration. Now, it's a good one because it's talking about the novel in a kind of overall sense, and the overall intentions of the novel. It's very much a kind of point of view within it. It's kind of point of view of the author. The idea of The Great Gatsby doesn't seek to kind of change things, to reform things, but it's kind of looking towards going back to a kind of older world. And it's a nice one because it also gives me a kind of contextual angle going with it, because it sees it as kind of a criticism of the modern world, and it's these kind of modern things that have kind of disrupted this old order. So you get restoration of a social order that's been confused and disturbed by reconfigurations of power and property, by the disheveling forces of the age, which is basically saying the modern age has kind of corrupted it. The next one I like is this one. Nick's irony does not always undercut the American dream upon which Gatsby's fantastic world is founded. So it's a nice one because it focuses on the ambiguity. It's going to allow me to discuss the ambiguity within the text. Rather, it locates Nick with the privileged denizens of the moneyed class, and in a position to detach himself and look from a distance on the foul dust that gathers in Gatsby's wake. So it allows me to discuss the way that Nick in the narrative is kind of placed as an observer. It links into the kind of class elements that go within the novel, and it also looks at that kind of again, going back to the kind of ambiguity as to how we view Gatsby within it. And then the third one that I choose to kind of try and work into various different questions would be this one. Nick can imagine the American romance. So Nick here, or the perspective of the authors of the kind of criticism, is that Nick is again that observer figure, and he recognizes that the American romance is something kind of compelling, but he's not himself seeking it. So he's kind of interested in it, but as kind of on a more kind of academic grounding. He's sort of interested in the principles that go with it. So a naive theme of folk consciousness, at once vulnerable and resistant to criticism. Nick's own career is not motivated by this theme, but he can hear its allure and entertain its enchantments. Now, the other reason I choose this one is that I think you can challenge this one as well. I think this is a good one to potentially bring into an essay and say, well, while some critics have said this, in fact, it can be argued that, is Nick totally unmotivated by this? When he first goes to New York, Can you not make the argument that he is motivated by this theme of the kind of the compelling American song, the American romance, that he is seeking these kind of enchantments, and it's only later that he kind of moves away from it. So you can challenge this as a quotation as well. So they would be the three I pick, and alongside just general kind of summarizing around the article, the overall ambiguity, I've then got a nice little basis in which I can bring into an essay. So I kind of return back to the question I posed at the start. American literature often obsesses over an idealized past that appears better than the present or future. Now, if I was answering this, and in a second, my kind of example point is going to come up, and I want you to have a quick read through of the kind of example point. I will move where the video image is, so that you can read it properly. So this would be my kind of example point. Pause me here for a minute, have a read through my example point. I'll just walk you through how it's then hitting the assessment objectives, and I'm going to encourage you to kind of have a go at using it as a model to do a further point of your own in which it's kind of getting in the criticism. Okay, so as I kind of introduce the point here, I'm making sure that I'm using terms from the question just to show that I'm kind of clearly answering the question and that I'm putting forward a view or a perspective that kind of goes with it. So the narrative voice of Nick and the retrospective nature of the narrative itself, with its return west after the souring of the initial optimism of the potential new America, arguably reflects a desire to return to an older America. So I'm starting to introduce that kind of difference between the contemporary America, the older America, the looking backwards. So I'm dealing with the question. I'm talking about narrative voice and the fact it's retrospective. So I'm using kind of relevant terminology in a broader sense. And I then kind of, I build up this argument somewhat. Whilst Nick does not necessarily idealize or obsess over the past, it is presented as having better moral values than the new America. So I'm then building this up, and I'm kind of choosing to take a bit of a middle ground within my argument as I present it. And I'm saying that it's not an obsession, it's not necessarily idealized, but it is presented as better. So I've kind of taken the question terms and used them. I'm then working in my piece of criticism. And as I say, I'm not using the whole of one of those quotes, but I'm just using part of it. And as Giltrow and Stouck note, the critical inclination of the Great Gatsby is not just towards reform, but towards restoration. And I then paraphrase the rest slightly just to get in, of a social order that's been disturbed by the modern age. So I'm using it to kind of reinforce the line of argument that I'm making. Nick's assertion at the start of the novel that he wanted the world to be in a uniform and sort of moral attention forever suggests he decides the order and rigid moral structures symbolised in the more conservative West. So I'm then starting to build in direct evidence from the novel, and I'm using this to kind of reinforce my point of view. I'm talking about it in a I'm still talking about it in terms of a kind of technique and intention way, but in a slightly more kind of generalized way. And I then kind of show how this is continued across the novel by focusing in onto the end. So I'm talking about beginning and the end. This view of an anticlimactic and bleaker present. And I then start talking about the kind of a paraphrasing around kind of Gatsby's house taking over the fresh green breast of the new world, and that idea of it being kind of corrupted, and I have the kind of born ceaselessly back into the past. So I'm building up with my other bits of evidence, and then again I kind of return to the kind of question again as I aim to close down the argument. And again, I can argue around this statement even as I progress through a paragraph. Here, Fitzgerald does not necessarily suggest that the past itself is better, but there's, this moment of failure in the past, and I'm kind of talking around it. So I've made an argument, I've got several pieces of evidence from the text, I've got my piece of criticism in there, and I'm clearly linking into the question as it kind of goes through. Now, what I'd like you to do, again, you can use any bits of the criticism you picked out, but have a go at kind of drafting yourself out a point, responding to that question. You can take one of my lines of argument, you can use your own line of argument, but work on trying to match your kind of style. Think about how they want you to respond to this, and trying to work towards that. So pause it, have a go at writing one, then I'll just go through some things around the kind of wider reading, okay? Okay, so as I say, don't get tied up with this. This isn't for the exam in a couple of weeks. This is more simply to encourage you to really start thinking about this now, because it is something that you want to build in over time. It's not something you can kind of cram in, okay? Now, as we discussed with the other Gatsby essay, with the American Lit paper, there is an expectation that you will be bringing in only a few brief references to wider reading. Now, this in many ways will feel kind of anticlimactic because you may have read an entire novel and will only quote kind of a couple of little bits within your main essay, but it's still an important part of it that you need to get in there if you're looking to get the top grades, okay? So, in terms of just some suggestions to get you sort of thinking about it now, I would suggest that between now and when you get to that exam, in kind of, I suppose it's about 15 months from now, no, a bit less than that for you lot, a bit over 12 months, I suppose, is that you make sure you've read at least one other novel outside our main novels that fits within American literature between 1880 and 1940. Now, one of the suggestions here would be that you use one of the other main texts from the specification, which are kind of listed here. The main reason why that's suggested is that obviously there'll be more study resources available for them, and you know that can help support your reading of them, especially when each person will potentially be choosing something different to read. So those are kind of main suggestions. Native Son is quite a kind of popular one. That's out of all of them, that's probably the one I recommend. But there's no reason why you have to read that one. There are some other suggestions that have kind of come up. The Call of the Wild by Jack London is kind of a good one. It's quite an interesting one. I like that one. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. This one I was introduced to this year by one of the second year students, The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. And that's an interesting one because it gives a kind of, it's not like the other ones, it's essentially a kind of murder mystery, but it falls within the period, and it kind of deals with a number of the issues. Now, there are other ways to kind of build in your wider reading. Now, I'd recommend you do at least one novel, but if not more, you then want to supplement this with some smaller bits of wider reading. So short stories, theatre and poetry can all be used as references as your wider reading and be built in there as well. There are a number of kind of short story suggestions. So we've already looked at one short story by Kate Chopin. And you can get kind of wider collections. Ernest Hemingway does a lot of short stories. If you think right back to the start of the year, it was Hills Like White Elephants by Hemingway we looked at. That could be worked in as wider reading, but you could look at his other short stories. And Charlotte Gilman Perkins is another kind of popular one where you can kind of buy her collected works. The main one that she's known for is The Yellow Wallpaper. In terms of theatre, there are some kind of classics of American literature that fall just outside the period. and Arthur Miller and kind of Tennessee Williams for this. Now, in terms of your wider reading, because it's in there to help with context as much as the kind of comparison, you can go slightly before and slightly after that central period. So I'm going to be using kind of later on with you Death of a Salesman, but things like, I say, Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman or Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire, things like that can be seen as showing a continuation of ideas that are introduced in the text that you're looking at, and they can still be used. Poetry-wise, I would recommend Walt Whitman, Robert Frost, and then into T.S. Eliot, because they show a kind of different mentality as they go through in terms of that, their kind of outlook essentially on America or the world as a whole. T.S. Eliot is kind of English-based, but he counts as an American poet because he's born in America and he sort of lives in America in his early kind of life. Now, I've introduced you to those. I've given you some sort of suggestions about where to look for those. It's about you at this stage starting to think, knowing that you need to do this. Have a look around, read the blurbs for the different books, have a quick research around, start to think, what am I doing over the next kind of 12, 13 months, over a year, to help get me ready for this exam in terms of the wider reading, because each of you will be doing slightly different things in relation to this. And whilst we will do bits of wider reading in class, we won't have time to do an entire extra full-length novel altogether. So you want to be looking, people, and starting to think about this now, and it's something that's going to be really pushed over summer as well in relation to kind of getting that wider reading in, okay? That's it for today though, people. Goodbye.